The Texas heat of 1873 shimmered like hellfire across the prairie as preacher Eli Matz followed a woman's faint moaning to an abandoned barn inside. He found Anth Cole bound and bleeding, her desperate plea, "Please, don't lift my skirt," echoing in the stifling air like a prayer he couldn't answer without losing everything he believed. Eli had spent 5 years preaching salvation to frontier souls, but his own faith had begun withering like crops in drought. At 28, he still believed in divine providence. Though doubt gnawed at his certainty like termites in old wood, the woman before him, brutalized beyond imagination, would test every sermon he'd ever preached about God's mercy. What began as a simple act of Christian charity would ignite into a reckoning that transformed preacher into protector, faith into fury, and two broken souls into an unbreakable alliance through blood and revelation. Eli and Anth would discover that sometimes salvation comes not from prayer, but from the courage to answer evil with decisive action. Texas, 1873. The frontier stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. Where law existed mainly in the barrels of guns and justice was whatever the strongest man decided it meant. Small settlements dotted the landscape like islands of civilization in an ocean of wild country, connected by dusty trails that carried both hope and terror in equal measure. This was land where men like Mason Graves could build empires through forgery, intimidation, and murder, confident that distance and corruption would protect them from consequences. Churches stood as fragile bastions against the darkness, their preachers fighting losing battles against human nature that seemed to grow more savage with each mile from established law. In this moral wilderness, a man's word meant exactly what his courage could enforce, and women like Anth existed at the mercy of those willing to use the most extreme violence to maintain their secrets. Eli's calling to preach had come during the war between the states, when he'd watched too many good men die for causes that seemed less righteous with each battlefield prayer he'd offered over broken bodies. His faith had been forged in the crucible of attempting to find divine purpose in human slaughter, emerging scarred but intact until the frontier began testing different aspects of his beliefs. 5 years of ministering to settlers, cowboys, and drifters had shown him that evil could flourish in God's creation with disturbing ease, making his sermons about divine justice sound increasingly hollow to his own ears. At 28, Eli possessed the education and eloquence to serve established churches back east, but something kept him in the wilderness, where civilization's veneer wore thinnest and souls faced their truest tests. His small congregation included farmers, ranchers, and townspeople who looked to him for answers. He increasingly questioned himself. The spiritual drought he'd been experiencing wasn't loss of belief, but growing awareness that faith required more than prayer. It demanded action that might contradict everything he'd been taught about turning the other cheek and leaving vengeance to the Lord. Beneath Eli's scholarly exterior lay a soul that recognized injustice with the clarity of someone who'd learned to read human nature through years of hearing confessions and offering comfort to the dying. His greatest strength was the ability to see past surface circumstances to moral foundations that couldn't be shaken by temporary doubts or challenging experiences. His deepest vulnerability was the tendency to intellectualize faith, when action was required, to seek theological answers when practical solutions were needed. The war had taught him that evil existed, but ministry had taught him that sometimes good people had to become instruments of divine wrath, whether they felt prepared for such responsibility or not. Finding Anth forced Eli to confront the gap between theological concepts of evil and its visceral reality, between abstract discussions of suffering and concrete evidence of human depravity that exceeded his worst imaginings. The words carved into her flesh, "She saw too much," represented systematic cruelty that challenged every sermon he'd preached about God's protection of the innocent. The real conflict lay not in helping her heal, but in what came after, whether he could maintain his role as spiritual shepherd while embracing the violent justice that her situation demanded. Mason Graves represented evil that wouldn't be deterred by moral persuasion or legal process, forcing Eli to choose between Christian pacifism and protective action that would transform him from minister into something harder and perhaps more necessary. Their partnership would test whether faith could survive the translation from theory into practice, whether love could grow from shared trauma, and whether redemption was possible for those who chose to meet violence with violence in defense of the innocent. But discovering the full extent of Anth's torture was only the beginning. A preacher who'd spent years talking about good and evil was about to learn the difference between knowing about darkness and having to fight it with his own hands. The moment Eli lifted Anth's torn skirt and saw the words carved into her thigh, his theological understanding of evil collided with its physical manifestation in ways that shattered 5 years of careful sermons and comfortable assumptions. She saw too much. The crude letters cut deep enough to scar permanently represented deliberate cruelty that transcended simple violence to become systematic torture designed to send messages to others who might dare witness Mason Graves's crimes. "Sweet, merciful God," he whispered, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. Mercy seemed absent from this barn where human beings had reduced a young woman to branded property, where his faith in divine protection met evidence of divine absence that made his previous spiritual doubts seem trivial by comparison. Anth's injuries went beyond the carved message burns, cuts, and bruises that spoke of prolonged torment inflicted not in passion, but with calculated precision. The men responsible weren't acting from momentary anger, but implementing systematic policy of terror designed to maintain silence through example. Carrying her to his cabin, Eli felt his identity shifting with each step. The preacher who'd counseled patience and forgiveness was being replaced by something harder, more primitive, more willing to embrace the violent justice that frontier conditions seemed to demand, despite everything his theological training had taught him about Christian responses to evil. Eli's cabin, furnished with books and simple furniture that reflected his scholarly nature, became makeshift hospital where he applied practical healing skills learned during the war to injuries that challenged his spiritual understanding of suffering. His careful cleaning and bandaging of her wounds represented more than medical treatment. It was ritual of reclaiming her humanity from men who tried to reduce her to object lesson. The supplies he gathered: clean bandages, antiseptic whiskey, herbal remedies learned from frontier women, served immediate needs while giving him time to process what he'd witnessed. Each gentle touch as he tended her injuries contradicted the brutal handling she'd endured. demonstrating that human hands could heal as well as harm, his vigil beside her bedside, watching for signs of infection or fever while she drifted between consciousness and delirium. Forced contemplation of questions his seminary training had never addressed. How could a just God permit such suffering? When did Christian mercy become complicity with evil? What did faith mean when prayer seemed inadequate response to systematic cruelty? The weapons he quietly prepared, cleaning his rifle, sharpening his hunting knife, checking ammunition supplies, marked his evolution from man of peace to man prepared for war. These weren't preparations born from fear, but from growing certainty that Mason Graves's violence would eventually find them, requiring response that transcended turning the other cheek. Anth's gradual recovery revealed both the depth of her trauma and the strength that had enabled her survival. Her reluctance to speak about her ordeal gave way slowly to trust in Eli's patient care. His refusal to demand explanations or judge her for whatever she'd witnessed that had marked her for death. When she finally told her story, Mason Graves' land fraud scheme, the murder of old Mr. Abernathy disguised as suicide, her unfortunate presence when secrets were revealed, Eli understood why such extreme measures had been taken to silence her. She wasn't just witness to theft, but to murder, making her testimony potentially fatal to men who'd built power through systematic crime. "They meant to kill me after," she whispered, her voice still rough from screaming. But Ree said Mason wanted to make an example first, show folks what happened to people who saw too much. Her matter-of-fact delivery of these horrific details revealed the pragmatic courage that had kept her alive. She understood the stakes better than Eli initially did. This wasn't just about her testimony, but about establishing precedent that would cow other potential witnesses into silence through fear. Their growing bond, forged through shared care and mutual recognition of the evil they faced, created partnership that transcended his role as rescuer and her status as victim. But understanding the scope of Mason Graves's crimes was only the beginning. A preacher learning to become a protector and a woman healing from systematic torture would soon face the test that would define them both forever. The first challenge was helping Anth heal from trauma that went far deeper than physical wounds. Her nightmares, her flinching at sudden movements, her inability to be touched without warning revealed conditioning that systematic torture had carved into her nervous system. Eli's patient presence, his consistent gentleness, and his refusal to pressure her for details beyond what she chose to share began the slow process of teaching her that not all human contact meant pain. His theological training in providing comfort to the afflicted proved valuable, but his growing rage at what had been done to her challenged every lesson about forgiveness and mercy he'd ever preached. As Anth's strength returned and her story emerged in fragments, Eli was forced to confront the scope of Mason Graves's criminal enterprise and its implications for anyone who dared challenge it. The land fraud scheme she'd witnessed wasn't isolated crime, but systematic policy that had probably affected dozens of families, while Abernathy's murder suggested willingness to kill anyone whose death would prove profitable. Eli's evolution from shocked preacher to determined protector accelerated as he realized that legal justice was impossible when corruption extended throughout local law enforcement, leaving personal justice as the only viable option for protecting Anth and preventing future victims. The growing intimacy between Eli and Anth, born from shared danger and mutual care rather than romantic attraction, created bonds that transcended traditional categories of helper and helped, protector and protected. Their planning for the inevitable confrontation with Graves's men revealed Anth's tactical intelligence and survival instincts, while Eli's willingness to abandon pacifist principles demonstrated how completely his priorities had shifted from maintaining theological purity to ensuring her safety. Their partnership became collaboration between equals rather than charity extended to victim, each contributing unique strengths to their shared goal of surviving whatever Mason Graves might send to finish what his men had started. Mason Graves' criminal network represented systematic corruption that extended far beyond individual crimes to encompass entire communities where fear had replaced law as the governing principle. His control over land records, local officials, and hired violence meant that conventional appeals to justice were worse than useless. They would simply identify new targets for elimination. The isolation of Eli's cabin, which had provided privacy for ministry and study, now became vulnerability that could be exploited by men who knew the territory better than either Eli or Anth. Their remote location meant that violence could occur without witnesses, while distance from potential allies made mutual support impossible. Time pressure mounted as Anth's disappearance from wherever Graves' men had held her would eventually be discovered, triggering search efforts designed not to rescue but to eliminate the witness, whose testimony could destroy carefully constructed criminal enterprise. Every day of delay increased the likelihood that professional killers would track them down before they could prepare adequate defenses. Most dangerously, the local community's fear of Mason Graves meant that even sympathetic neighbors would be reluctant to provide assistance or shelter, leaving Eli and Anth to face organized violence with only their own resources and determination. Under mounting pressure, both Eli and Anth discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Eli's transformation from scholarly preacher to pragmatic protector required abandoning theological abstractions in favor of practical wisdom about human nature and violent conflict. His growing comfort with weapons and tactical planning revealed aptitudes that seminary training had never developed, but frontier survival demanded. Anth's recovery from victim to partner demonstrated resilience that went beyond mere survival to encompass strategic thinking about how to turn her knowledge of Graves's crimes into weapons for their mutual protection. Her familiarity with frontier life, her practical skills, and her intimate knowledge of the men hunting them made her invaluable ally rather than burden requiring protection. Their relationship deepened beyond caregiver and patient into genuine partnership, where each contributed essential elements to their shared survival. Eli's education and social standing provided legitimacy and resources, while Anth's hard-won knowledge of their enemies and practical experience with violence provided tactical advantages. Most importantly, they both learned that love could grow from circumstances that had nothing to do with romance. The deep bond between people who'd chosen to face impossible odds together rather than surrender to forces that denied their right to exist safely. Intelligence gathered from Anth's memories of her captivity revealed that Mason Graves operated with military precision, employing men whose loyalty was purchased through fear and profit rather than ideology or personal attachment. His willingness to torture witnesses rather than simply killing them suggested psychological profile that found pleasure in inflicting suffering, making negotiation or mercy impossible. The systematic nature of his land fraud scheme indicated long-term planning and substantial financial resources that could fund extended manhunt if necessary. His network of informants throughout the territory meant that conventional hiding places would provide only temporary sanctuary before discovery and elimination. Most ominously, Anth's carved message, "She saw too much," indicated that Graves viewed her survival as an intolerable threat to his entire operation. The publicity that would result from her testimony could unravel years of careful criminality, making her elimination worth any investment of time, money, or violence. The approaching confrontation would test not just their physical courage, but their moral resolve, whether they could kill in defense of innocence without becoming the monsters they were fighting, whether justice obtained through violence could remain justice, and whether their souls could survive the transformation from victims to victors in a war they hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. As Mason Graves' men closed in on their isolated cabin, Eli and Anth faced their ultimate test, a confrontation that would determine whether faith could survive when forced to pull the trigger, and whether love born from shared trauma could endure beyond survival. The attack came at dusk, when shadows offered cover and exhaustion might dull their vigilance. 3 riders approached Eli's cabin with the casual confidence of men who'd done this work many times before Clyde, Ree, and a third man whose name would die with him. Their arrival wasn't surprise, but inevitability, the natural conclusion to a hunt that had begun the moment Anth had witnessed Mason Graves' crimes. "We know you're in there, preacher," Clyde called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "Send out the girl, and we'll make this quick for both of you. Keep hiding her, and we'll take our time with what comes next." From their prepared position behind reinforced windows, Eli felt the last vestiges of his ministerial identity dissolving like salt in water. These weren't men who could be reasoned with, converted, or appealed to through Christian mercy. They were predators whose only language was violence, whose only God was fear, whose only law was whatever Mason Graves commanded. Anth's steady breathing beside him, her competent checking of her hunting knife, her calm assessment of their tactical situation revealed the warrior she'd become through surviving what would have broken weaker spirits. The brutalized victim he'd found in the barn had been transformed by healing and purpose into someone capable of meeting violence with violence. "They're not leaving without finishing what they started," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Mason can't afford to let me live, and now you're a witness too. This ends here, one way or another." The moment when Clyde kicked in the door marked the end of Eli's old life and the beginning of something harder, more necessary, and infinitely more honest than anything he'd experienced behind a pulpit. As the 3 men stormed into his cabin with drawn weapons and murder in their eyes, Eli faced the choice that would define not just his survival, but his soul remain the preacher who counseled turning the other cheek. or become the instrument of justice that frontier conditions demanded. The theological debates that had occupied his mind during months of spiritual doubt suddenly seemed trivial compared to the immediate reality of evil that intended to destroy everything he'd come to value. His rifle felt foreign in his hands, despite years of hunting for food. Taking human life required different calculations than killing deer or rabbits, demanded moral certitude that his seminary training had never addressed. But looking at Anth, seeing her prepare to fight for both their lives with the fierce competence of someone who'd already survived the worst these men could inflict, he understood that some choices transcended abstract ethics to become simple matters of love, protecting love. "You came here to finish torturing an innocent woman," Eli said, his voice carrying authority he'd never possessed in the pulpit. "That makes you servants of hell, not men deserving Christian mercy." The gunfight that followed was brief, brutal, and decisive. Eli's first shot took Clyde in the chest before the man could fully clear his weapon, while his second dropped the unnamed third man who'd been moving to flank their position. Anth's blade found Ree's heart with the precision of someone who'd learned anatomy through suffering, her strike ending his life before he could cry out or return fire. In the sudden silence that followed the violence, both survivors understood that they'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, become people they'd never intended to become, chosen survival over the identities that had previously defined them. The aftermath of killing required practical decisions that had nothing to do with moral philosophy and everything to do with preventing discovery of their actions. 3 bodies in Eli's cabin represented evidence that could bring Mason Graves's entire network down on them with overwhelming force, making disposal not just convenience, but necessity for continued survival. Working through the night to bury the corpses, they discovered that violence created its own intimacy shared knowledge that transformed them from survivors into conspirators, from people who defended themselves into people who'd chosen to eliminate threats permanently. The physical labor of digging graves by moonlight became ritual that marked their complete break from previous lives. "We can't go back to who we were," Anth said, as they covered the last grave with rocks and brush designed to hide any trace of what lay beneath. "Mason will know they're missing, and he'll know what that means." Eli's response revealed the depth of his transformation. "Good. Let him know. Let him understand that some people fight back, that his reign of terror has limits, that there are consequences for what he's done to you and others." The preacher who'd questioned his faith had found it again not in prayer, but in action, not in mercy, but in justice, not in forgiveness, but in the willingness to ensure that evil faced adequate response. But killing Mason Graves' men was only the beginning. As dawn broke over their transformed lives, Eli and Anth faced the challenge of building a future from the violent death of their past selves. The dawn that followed their nocturnal burial work illuminated 2 people who'd been fundamentally changed by violence and survival. Eli's hands, which had once turned pages of scripture in blessed congregations, now bore calluses from digging graves and gun oil stains from weapons maintenance. Anth's scarred body had become temple of survival rather than victim of torture, her bearing confident rather than broken. Their preparation for departure involved more than packing supplies. It required shedding identities that had been destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Eli's ministerial clothing, his theological books, his carefully crafted sermons about divine mercy were abandoned as relics of a worldview that couldn't encompass the realities they'd faced together. "Where do we go from here?" Anth asked, her question encompassing more than geographical destination. They were no longer preacher and victim, rescuer and rescued, but partners in survival who'd proven their willingness to kill for each other. Eli's answer revealed how completely he'd embraced their transformation. Somewhere we can build something clean from what we've learned. Somewhere Mason Graves can't find us, but if he does, he'll discover we're not the same people who ran from his justice. We're people who make our own justice now. The decision to leave together carried weight beyond mere practical arrangement. It represented commitment between two people who'd seen each other at their most vulnerable and most violent, who'd shared trauma and triumph in ways that created bonds deeper than marriage vows or family ties. Their final survey of the cabin where they'd found healing and been forced to kill revealed how completely the space had been transformed by their experiences. The rooms where Eli had tended Anth's wounds now held ghosts of the men they'd killed, while the peaceful study where he'd questioned his faith had become armory where they'd prepared for war. "Do you think God will forgive us?" Anth asked, her question revealing depths of concern that went beyond immediate survival to encompass eternal consequences of their actions. Eli's response demonstrated the theological evolution that violence had forced upon him. "I think God created a world where innocent people get tortured and good people have to become killers, too. Stop it. If he doesn't understand why we did what we did, then maybe his forgiveness isn't worth having." The blasphemy that would have horrified his former self now felt like honest assessment of moral complexity that seminary training had never addressed adequately. The journey away from the cabin became pilgrimage toward new understanding of faith that encompassed both divine love and human responsibility for defending it. Eli's conversations with Anth revealed theological insights that couldn't be found in books, understanding that mercy without justice was weakness, that love without the willingness to fight for it was sentimentality, that faith without action was merely intellectual exercise. His evolution from questioning preacher to confident protector hadn't diminished his relationship with God, but had deepened it through direct experience of evil that required divine response. Through human instruments, the prayers he offered now were different, not requests for guidance, but expressions of gratitude for the strength to act when action was necessary. "I still believe," he told Anth as they made camp their first night on the trail. "But I believe in a God who expects his people to get their hands dirty stopping evil, not a God who rewards passivity while innocents suffer." Her response revealed the spiritual growth that shared trauma and triumph had fostered. "Maybe finding you in that barn wasn't accident. Maybe God knew I needed someone willing to become what you became for me." Their relationship, forged through extreme circumstances, had evolved beyond simple gratitude or proximity into genuine partnership between equals who'd proven their commitment to each other through actions rather than words. The intimacy they shared had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with the profound trust between people who'd been willing to kill and die for each other. The practical arrangements of their shared travel dividing responsibilities, making decisions together, planning for various contingencies, demonstrated collaboration built on mutual respect and proven competence. Anth's knowledge of frontier survival complemented Eli's education and social skills, creating capabilities neither possessed alone. Their evening conversations around campfires revealed philosophical development that theological training and brutal experience had combined to create. They discussed justice, mercy, the nature of evil, and the responsibilities of good people in ways that encompassed both intellectual rigor and practical wisdom, earned through violence and survival. "We're different now," Anth observed as they planned their route toward territories where Mason Graves' influence couldn't reach, not just from what we survived, but from who we chose to become when surviving required becoming something new. Eli's agreement carried weight of recognition. We're who we were always supposed to be. But it took extreme circumstances to force us to become it. Maybe that's what faith really means, not believing in comfort, but trusting that we can become what justice requires us to become. Their plans for establishing new lives in territories beyond Mason Graves' reach included both practical necessities and deeper purposes that their experiences had revealed. They would find land where Eli could use his education in ways that didn't require ministerial credentials, while Anth could apply her hard-won survival skills without being defined by her traumatic past. The community they hoped to build would be based on principles learned through violence, that evil existed, that good people had responsibilities to stop it, that justice sometimes required methods that challenged conventional morality. Their home would be sanctuary for others fleeing circumstances that reduced them to victims, proof that transformation was possible even after the worst experiences. Children, if they were blessed with them, would grow up understanding that strength without compassion was cruelty, but compassion without strength was invitation to victimization. They would know that their parents had faced ultimate tests of character and emerged as people worthy of respect and trust. "We'll build something clean," Eli promised as they rode toward their unknown future. "Something that honors what we learned about both human evil and human capacity to overcome it. Something that proves love can grow from the strangest soil when it's watered with courage instead of tears." The morning they reached the territorial border that marked their entry into country where Mason Graves' name carried no weight, both Eli and Anth performed small rituals that acknowledged their complete transformation from who they'd been into who they'd chosen to become. Eli buried his ministerial collar beside a creek, not in rejection of faith, but in recognition that his calling had evolved beyond institutional requirements into personal mission that encompassed protection as well as comfort. His prayers that morning were different, not requesting divine intervention, but expressing gratitude for divine partnership in the work of justice. Anth washed the carved words from her thigh in the same creek, the scars remaining, but their power to define her finally dissolving. She was no longer the woman who'd seen too much, but the woman who'd survived everything and emerged stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who threatened innocence. Their first settlement in new territory attracted other refugees from various forms of oppression, creating community based on shared understanding that survival sometimes required transformation that challenged conventional categories of good and evil. Eli's reputation as someone who'd abandoned pacifism when pacifism became complicity attracted people who needed leaders willing to fight for justice rather than merely preach about it. Anth's skills as healer and protector made her valuable community member whose past became source of wisdom rather than shame. Together, they proved that the most broken beginnings could produce the most beautiful outcomes when supported by courage, commitment, and willingness to become whatever love required. But their greatest legacy would be the proof that faith could indeed survive its collision with evil, not by avoiding the darkness, but by learning to be light strong enough to drive it back. Within 2 years of their arrival in new territory, the community that formed around Eli and Anth had become known throughout the region as a place where justice prevailed despite or perhaps because of its leaders' willingness to use violence when violence was the only effective response to evil. Their reputation for protecting the vulnerable while refusing to tolerate predators attracted both grateful settlers and hostile attention from those who profited from others' weakness. Eli's evolution from preacher to protector influenced territorial policy toward self-defense and community justice, while Anth's survival story inspired other women to speak out against systematic abuse rather than accepting it as an inevitable aspect of frontier life. Their partnership demonstrated that healing from extreme trauma was possible when supported by someone willing to fight for the victim's right to rebuild their life safely. The legal precedents they established defending their community through organized resistance rather than appealing to distant authorities influenced territorial development toward local control and immediate justice that made frontier life safer for honest families while more dangerous for predators. The community they founded remained a landmark of successful alternative justice for generations, its story inspiring movements toward local self-governance and community-based law enforcement throughout the American West. Their emphasis on protecting the vulnerable while holding evildoers accountable influenced territorial policies that strengthened local authority while maintaining moral standards. Eli's theological evolution from abstract faith to practical Christianity that encompassed protective violence when necessary influenced frontier religious development toward denominations that honored both mercy and justice, both forgiveness and accountability. His sermons, when he occasionally preached, became legendary for their integration of spiritual wisdom with practical experience of good and evil. Anth's transformation from victim to protector inspired legal frameworks that recognized survivors' rights to defend themselves and others from systematic abuse. Her story became cited in court cases involving self-defense, community protection, and the rights of witnesses to violent crimes to take measures necessary for their continued survival. The partnership they modeled based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and willingness to sacrifice comfort for justice influenced frontier marriage patterns toward greater equality and shared responsibility. Their community became destination for couples seeking alternatives to traditional gender roles that left women vulnerable and men isolated. Most significantly, their story provided proof that faith could indeed survive collision with ultimate evil when believers were willing to become instruments of divine justice rather than passive recipients of divine mercy. Eli's journey from questioning preacher to confident protector demonstrated that true faith sometimes required abandoning religious comfort to embrace spiritual responsibility. That included willingness to fight for what was right. His integration of theological knowledge with practical experience of good and evil created wisdom that served his community for decades. Anth's evolution from torture victim to respected community leader proved that the most extreme trauma could be transformed into sources of strength and wisdom when supported by someone willing to see worth rather than damage, potential rather than just pain. Together, they embodied the frontier ideal of reinvention, people who created new identities based on moral courage rather than social convention. True faith isn't tested by comfort, but by collision with evil that demands response. The deepest love grows not from easy circumstances, but from willingness to become whatever protection requires, whatever justice demands, and whatever healing needs in order to flourish. Their legacy endures in every relationship that chooses courage over comfort, action over passive acceptance, and love that fights rather than love that merely endures. The preacher who lost his faith when he lifted a tortured woman's skirt found it again when he pulled the trigger to defend her life, discovering that sometimes the most sacred acts looked nothing like what we expected holiness to require. Their story reminds us that faith without works is indeed dead, that mercy without justice is mere sentimentality, and that the deepest spiritual truths are often learned not in churches, but in moments when we must choose between our comfort and others' survival. In the end, Eli didn't lose his faith in that barn. He found the courage to live it fully, to become the instrument of divine justice that his theological training had only taught him to pray for. Anth's scars became testimonies not to evil's power, but to survival's triumph. Proof that even the most systematic cruelty cannot destroy the human capacity to heal, to grow, and to become fierce protectors of others facing similar darkness. Together, they proved that when good people are willing to become dangerous to dangerous people, evil loses its power to terrorize the innocent into silence and submission.